from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
At the time of the taping of this program, the Pacific Northwest Political Science Association has been meeting in our city here in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and we're so fortunate today to have on our program 3 of those political scientists who are attending that conference. And as they have a variety of expertise and background, our program will not be about just one topic, but a series of issues that they are very highly qualified to address. For example, we're going to talk about the contemporary Congress and some of the changes in the structure and the rules and the personnel of the Congress. We're also going to talk some about the issue of hate crimes and hate messages and fighting fear with one of our political scientists and how law distinguishes between pure speech and action. And we'll touch on a number of other issues. But let's get to the program by welcoming our 3 guests today. We're very pleased to welcome, first of all, Dr. Ralph Miner. He holds a Ph.D. in political science from the University of Oregon and is on the faculty at Western Washington University. Dr. Miner, it's a pleasure to have you in Coeur d'Alene and on this program. Our next guest is Dr. Vernon Johnson. He holds a Ph.D. from Washington State University, and he also is on the faculty at Western Washington University. And Dr. Vernon Johnson, it's a pleasure to have you in our city and on the program.
Thank you.
And our third guest today is Dr. Richard Moore. He holds a Ph.D. from the University of Arizona. He is on the faculty at Lewis Clark State College and has been a friend a long time and been on our program before. And again, Dr. Moore, it's a pleasure to have you here with us today.
Thank you.
And as always, I'm so pleased to have regular panelist Janelle Burke, who holds a degree in Doctor of Jurisprudence and is an attorney in Idaho, and we'll ask Janelle to commence today's questioning.
Dr. Moore, my first question is for you. Can you explain to our viewing audience what your group is and why it's meeting here?
Sure. It's a group of mostly professors and our graduate students and undergraduate students who get together once a year from basically Washington and Oregon, and incidentally Alberta, British Columbia, Alaska, Idaho, Montana, and then Utah, Nevada, and California occasionally. And we're in our 49th year. I think we started in 48. And it's like all political science, it covers American politics, non-American politics, international politics, public law, political philosophy and ideology, voting, almost anything to do with politics and government.
So you cover a variety of subjects.
Oh yeah, it's an enormous field. From Marx to Aristotle and from Newt Gingrich to Yasser Arafat.
And one of those subjects that you've been dealing with has been the Congress, the changes that are occurring in the Congress. And Dr. Miner, could you explain to our viewing audience what some of the theories are and what is happening with the United States Congress?
Yes, well, I suppose it's easier to talk about the House of Representatives in particular because of the fact that Newt Gingrich and the contract with America attracted so much attention throughout the country and is of interest to a great many people. But we'd also see changes in the Senate as well. But these changes have revolved around, in my judgment, making the Congress more of a body of individuals and less a body of parties. That there is more, in a sense, individuation, so to speak, with respect to particularly many of the freshmen who come to the House and Senate without particular history or background in the traditions or the party disciplines of the past. And of course, this is a matter of degree. And in particular, I think this begins to show up when Representative Gingrich creates, for example, task forces which take over work formerly handled exclusively by committees. That would be one example of a new process in the House, at least.
And in some of those instances, the work that is now being done is being done then by task forces. This eliminates the seniority system, I would take it. So it allows people to begin dealing at a leadership level with sort of freshman status. Is that correct?
Right. Well, actually, it continues a weakening of the seniority system. Seniority had started to weaken even before, over the years, but this is another step in the weakening of seniority, and has given Speaker Gingrich power to a degree that some people find unprecedented. But then on the other hand, other people point out that, well, we haven't heard as much from him lately as we did originally. So maybe it's not quite as clear-cut a loss of power as one might have thought.
One other quick question with regard to individuation. Does that mean that single issue representatives are more likely to be elected now than in the past?
Yes. And in terms of when they get into the Congress, basically, there is now kind of a concentration or a focus on, quote, your issue, unquote, and other matters being relatively secondary to that. Obviously, you still have loyalty to the leaders and to your party to a degree, and this is all just a matter of some change in recent years. I think, in particular, that the freshmen, many of them, have been chafing quite visibly under attempts at Republican discipline in the House, and they have not been all that comfortable with it. But yet the leadership has been able to, in a sense, get their support at critical times.
Now, Dr. Johnson, moving to the Pacific Northwest more, you have been presenting some information with regard to hate crimes and fear groups that get their support from fear or grow from fear. Are these growing groups? Number one is the first part of my question is, are these growing groups? And number two, can we get into some of the area about speech and how speech affects these groups?
Well, I think, over the last decade or so, this is an area which has experienced some of this sort of far-right extremism for nearly 20 years or so now. And people with those predispositions appear to be moving into northern Idaho, the Pacific Northwest in general, to create their sort of white utopia. Is there a growth of this activity? I was just at a conference in Colorado Springs about a month ago, and people were presenting information that they do see a growth, an explosion of militias and white supremacists since the Oklahoma City bombing. So whereas we might have thought that after that some of these people would have slowed down their activity, they sort of gone into the woodwork, but they are still around. In fact, under the notion of leaderless resistance, it's often hard to tell just how many of these groups there are, but there's some evidence that their numbers are growing.
And in terms of free speech, how does this fit into the whole movement?
Well, in my area, you have people who are displaying Confederate symbols at a local high school where there are a large Hispanic and Native American population, and so it becomes a race issue with those populations, and there's been some physical intimidation associated with it. The school district made a decision that the symbols could not be displayed within the school building, and school districts can do that if they decide that such activity gets in the way of the education process, which at that high school it had started to do. So there are some free speech issues that come into play here. A lot of it has more to do with acts of violence and physical intimidation, however.
When we talk about free speech for a minute, let's just indicate to our readers, what does speech include? That is, it's not just me talking to you or me writing something, but what all does it include?
Well, at the local high school near Bellingham, Washington, it included wearing lapel pins that were Confederate flags, carrying around flags themselves and waving them in the halls and this sort of thing. So symbolic speech in this case, is included.
I want to proceed with that. Like Janelle, I'm going to ask some questions, all of you, on these various topics, but I want to continue with the conversation with Dr. Johnson. Certainly there are many civil rights groups in the United States that are working to, one, inform the public about the various groups that are sending out messages of hate, identifying them and talking about the difference between their comments and their actions. Would you discuss with us some of those questions in this light? Where do we draw the line, both from a constitutional question, and I address you as a political scientist, and in the form of statutes? What I'm attempting to say is the United States Supreme Court has the opportunity to address some of those questions, along with both federal and state laws. And states, I believe, have been more active than the national government in dealing with what we call anti-hate crime laws. Would you, from your vantage point, define for us what should be declared in violation of the law and what would be permissible, but would come under the umbrella of a watchdog to warn citizens about the message that is being given by those groups?
Well, it's from my own perspective. For instance, burning a cross, someplace. Well, we had a cross burning incident in Whatcom County, Washington, about 3 years ago, at a migrant farm workers residential camp. And that was clearly, a hate crime. But there was a family, a black family, that apparently was considering buying a house in the South Seattle suburbs a couple of years ago, and they were spending some time around the place. By some manner, a neighbor across the street became aware that they were considering buying the house. Burned a cross on his front lawn while the black family was around. So they had not yet moved in or anything like that. It became, of course, they filed suit as a, against in terms of the Washington State malicious harassment law. But it was said that as long as he's on his own property, it was his free speech. Now, I think that the statute should go further than that. Given our tragic history in terms of race, America cannot be a free country equally for all when, if you're looking at real estate, people can burn crosses and send you the message that you're not welcome. So that's I guess an area where I see where it could go further. But there's a lot of resistance to intrusive government these days.
Certainly the Supreme Court in recent cases has distinguished between those areas that you're talking about. The Supreme Court has indicated that when individuals gather and they talk about certain hate, and then from that meeting they decide to go out and take action against an individual, that once they take that action to verbally threaten them or actually physically attack them, that malicious harassment laws come into place. So they certainly are some defined areas now that action can be taken. Dr. Moore, I'd like to bring you into this conversation. Idaho is one of those states that has a remarkable list of anti-hate crime laws, and they were very active in putting those in place during the problems here in the 80s. And Montana certainly is one. And the issue I'd like to address is in that area of malicious harassment laws, both civil and criminal provisions, that people can be prosecuted for maliciously harassing someone. They also can be civilly sued. And my question has to do with what I call, and the court has described as enhancement provisions. Montana has an excellent law. And if I can just, for the sake of our viewers, say that if someone goes out and maliciously attacks someone, the regular criminal statutes would indicate that that person can be prosecuted for assault and battery and so forth. But if one can prove that that person was attacked because of their classification of race, color, etc., while sentencing that person for the assault, one can enhance the punishment because it was a malicious attack upon an identified group in society and therefore have a longer sentence. Would you, based on that very long elaboration, express your reaction to that and your interpretation of the purpose why we do that, and secondly, the benefits that you'd perceive that would come from that kind of legislation?
Well, first of all, it's a positive. The existence of that enhancement type of legislation is a positive statement by state governments that certain virtues, certain correct public behaviors are to be preserved, and certain types of behavior are not to be condoned. And compounding the felony, as it were, by this type of thing, it's a positive statement that this is just exactly as if you were using a firearm in the conduct of a crime. It will enhance the effect the same
In other words,
way.
their precedent's already set in other categories where we can have enhanced in sentencing and have had prior to those laws.
Oh, certainly. It's an extenuation mitigation type of a thing in reversed, in a sense. It exacerbates the damage to society. I mean, that's the philosophical position, is that society is not just being hurt by this person violating the law, but they're violating basic principles of living together in our society as we want to. That's the rationale for it, and as far as I know, it's been upheld everywhere. There's conspiracy laws that are at work, and they're insightful, incendiary laws that will incite people to violence or indeed plan violence. That is also is relevant to this. And there's also the conspiracy to overthrow the government type of
getting
laws,
the
sedition type of things that are at work sometimes in this. So there's a variety of laws that indeed work against speech, but it's not what would be called free speech.
I'd like to ask Dr. Johnson to speak to this issue too. I know, as someone who's followed this very carefully over the years myself, that one of the rationales behind that legislation is that when we identify class and groups of people that are more likely to be victims, more daily in danger, that this is a way of trying to address that problem. Would you like to speak to that question? And I don't know how you react to this, but we do see a decline in the last couple of years in some hate crimes in some parts of the country. Has this legislation probably been beneficial in those statistics?
Yeah, we see a decline in the statistics, and hopefully that reflects the fact that there's less of this sort of thing taking place. I do think that there's also been a growth in all across what I call the Intermountain West of human rights organizations in local communities, like your Kootenai County Committee Task Force for Human Relations here, which was the original group of this type in the United States, we believe, to our own Whatcom County Human Rights Task Force in Washington. And I think that what happens is that when these extremists see that there's a community response to their activity, then they recede into the woodwork because what they thought was a receptive audience out there has turned out to be something more complicated. And so they're not willing to put themselves out there in that way if they don't have the kind of support that they thought they did.
I hear you saying to the communities have a lot of power to send messages through their work to an organization, not just law. Dr. Miner, I certainly want to take advantage of your expertise. I, like our other panel members, you appreciate your being here very much. And there is a major change going on in government, and I'd like to have a rather involved question for you and share your expertise with our people. It seems to me that there is a change between the executive branch and the legislative branch because of what you talked about, that I think you have really identified major changes in the Congress. And it seems to me that that's affected that relationship. I'd like you to speak to that question of whether or not you think it has affected the relationship. And in the case of President Clinton, has it made it easier for him to work with Congress, even though they're two different parties, than it would have been under the other system, regardless of which party controlled Congress? Has this affected that relationship?
Well, it'll be difficult to say whether it's made it easier from a standpoint of political science, but what I think is an interesting aspect of your question has been what I consider to be the relative success of Bill Clinton in the use of the veto power, when to use it, when not to use it, and in his relationships with Congress, shaping outcomes through that veto or the threat of a veto. And I think he's been, in that context, very skillful. And so that despite the fact that the Republicans control both houses, of course, that he's been able to do quite well in his relationships with them, sometimes to the consternation of the Democratic leaders in the House and Senate. And we shall see whether he's able to get his people to stay behind him, for example, on free trade, and continue to expand free trade down to Latin America and things, issues like that.
I guess what I'm looking at is comparing our system with the British system, where
Right.
party block voting is obviously very, very clear. And if I hear you saying that because of this restructuring of Congress, that party discipline is weaker, does it make it easier for the president to form? It seems on some of these votes in the House, particularly, he's been able to form a coalition of Republicans and Democrats to prevail on certain issues that might not happen if it was more party discipline.
Well, I certainly think that NAFTA is the outstanding example of that. And in terms of the Senate has a role to play too, of course, in this. But if I might, there's one question or issue that has come up here I'd like to address for just a minute, and
Sure.
that is the matter of speech and your discussion with Professor Johnson about speech, and my concern with the Supreme Court's Buckley versus Vallejo holding that money is speech. And when it comes to campaign finance reform. So I think there is another free speech issue that confronts the nation right now in a very serious way insofar as the whole idea of campaign finance reform is concerned.
Thank you for bringing that up. It's a really important issue. And let me take that one step further before I go back to Janelle. The court has a role in this, and so some of those who are debating very seriously in the Congress about the extent of meaningful campaign finance reform are indicating that even though the Congress might or might not be willing to pass certain kind of legislation, and let's suppose that they do, will it meet the constitutional test? The court seems to be, from some previous recent cases, very hesitant about allowing Congress to regulate financing based on speech. Would you address that question?
Well, and I think the basic question is there, and it's sometimes have difficulty, for example, talking about this with students even, in terms of the idea that a person who has more money is entitled to more speech, is something that many of them find difficult, particularly in a political context, obviously from the standpoint of First Amendment. Freedoms are, of course, vitally important to us all. But at the same time, there are many, as you know, who are so deeply concerned about the role of money in politics that in a sense they're perhaps willing to go further than the present court, at least, would ever be willing to allow.
Thank you.
Right.
Janelle Burke.
I want to expand a little bit on that same issue of campaign reform. What do you foresee is going to be happening? What are the major issues, do you think? I know it's a very large area, but
Right.
But what are, if you were going to zero in on a couple of points that you think are really important for Americans to be considering, what would those be?
Well, I think in terms of the issues, they would be, as was evident in the so-called poison pill amendment offered by Senator Lott, that would have, in a sense, killed the bill by allowing each union member to designate whether his or her money, dues, or portion thereof could be used for political purposes, that if the amendment had been adopted, there was the rationale for the Republicans and some Democrats to vote against it. And of course, you know, because of the cloture requirements, it took 60 votes, not a simple majority, to get this legislation adopted. And frankly, I think that is an issue where, in my own judgment, and it's obviously, I don't have data on this, but it would certainly be an indication that there are some Democrats who would harbor doubts as to whether or not they would contribute to that 60-vote total, because they might be for campaign finance reform, but on the other hand, they're not willing to have fewer contributions to their own campaign. You see the point I'm driving at in terms of this relationship cuts both ways for them as a body and as individuals who have to get elected or, in this case, reelected.
So you think campaign financing is going to continue to be something that's on the front burner as far as the American people are concerned, and it's nowhere nearly come to a closure of any type?
Right, and I would say that that's true even if both houses adopt it, that the courts will have their say and they will have their day.
And Dr. Moore, do you have a comment with regard to that whole issue of campaign finance?
Well, as a political scientist, I guess I I must have a comment. It's not my field. Dr. Johnson and I are both in comparative politics, and we don't really specialize in American, but still, it raises a fascinating question. I mean, I think it's one of the issues that is really sneaking up on the edge of utter boredom to the American public. The congressional investigations of the presidential campaign thing. It's apparently a non-starter as far as public interest goes. But the nature of the way politics will be done in the United States is vitally dependent upon the outcome of this debate. The Republicans can spend lots of money. The Democrats have a harder time doing it, and
it's necessary to spend lots of money now to get elected to any national office.
This media is so expensive. Commercial television is so expensive to run a campaign. And a small legislative race in Idaho, representative thing, could easily cost $35,000 to $40,000 and even $60,000 for a state legislature, which is just unheard of compared to 10 years ago, let alone 20 years ago. And for George Nethercutt said that he could not really countenance raising $6 million for a Senate race, and he said that would be $16,000 a day from the day he said that until the day of the election. That's just so much money. The nature of American politics is, I think, irreparably changed. I suppose irreparably is the wrong word, but it's kind of a scary thing. But unfortunately, it's more scary because it's kind of a boring thing to the American public.
Now, our time is very, very short. But in the small amount of remaining time that we have, my question is for Dr. Johnson, and has to do with insightful speech. That speech that incites to riot or incites to bad behavior. Do you have a comment?
Well, it's like screaming fire in a full theater. I mean, that speech should be illegal, and I think that it often is. I think it's judged as such. So I don't see any big difficulties in that area.
Well, I want to say on behalf of Janelle Burke and members of our staff that we've been delighted to have you here. Dr. Ralph Miner and Dr. Vernon Johnson and Dr. Richard Moore, three political scientists. I don't get very often to interview political scientists, and it's always wonderful to me to be with my colleagues. And I think you've been very generous with your time. We're so happy you chose our city to come to for this conference, and we hope you'll come back in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed this program as much as we've enjoyed bringing it to you, and we'd like to invite you to be with us again next week at this very same time, when we will discuss yet another issue that we think of as important to all of our viewers. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.